On March 11, 2025, Bozeman Yellowstone International Airport in Montana. The 7 visitors waited for their shuttle, unaware of danger. Suddenly, alarms blared. Staff yelled at people to go inside. A thunderous roar shook the air as the bear smashed through the fence and charged into the parking lot. Screams erupted as families fled toward the terminal. Deputy Thompson and Officer Reyes arrived with rifles, but crowds blocked any clear shot. The bear roared again, crashing against cars. Smoke rose from a damaged sedan. Samira tripped, and Tony lifted her up. The bear lunged, striking him down with one brutal swipe. Samira cried out as Leo pulled her back. Eli froze in shock, camera trembling. Nearby, Aisha was shoved aside by stampeding passengers. Yukio and Daiichi sprinted for a side door, hearts thudding. The bear roared once more, sending more people scattering. Thompson fired, grazing its flank. It roared in rage, raking a van with its claws. Another officer tried to aim, but panicked bystanders ran between them. Inside staff lowered metal gates. Samira stumbled in with Leo, while Eli followed, tears in his eyes. Tony lay outside, unmoving on the asphalt. Lights flickered as a recorded voice urged everyone to remain calm. Fear coursed through the terminal. Aisha crouched by a check-in counter, breathing hard. People huddled along walls, sobbing. An elderly man pounded on a locked door, begging to be let in. The overhead alarms kept shrieking. In a dim corridor, Yukio and Daiichi hid behind crates, hearing roars echo through the halls. Their dream of seeing a bear had turned into a nightmare. Outside, Thompson radioed for backup. The wounded bear paced among destroyed cars, panting but still lethal. Tony lay alone, unreachable, as medics waited in vain. Sirens blared, mixing with frantic screams. The bear swung its head, deciding where to attack next. Inside, Samira moaned, clutching a bleeding arm. Leo knelt beside her, pressing a cloth against the wound. Eli stood watch, haunted by Tony's final moment. A staff member said paramedics couldn't reach the lot yet. Samira's voice cracked as she called Tony's name. Aisha crept through a hall, finding other travelers crying or in shock. She heard someone say they saw the bear knock down a man near the curb. She bowed her head, wishing she could help. Yukio and Daiichi, meanwhile, encountered an airport worker who warned them the building was under lockdown. They crouched behind a storage room door, hearts racing at each roar. More police arrived, forming a barricade near the parking area. The bear, limping from its wound, still roared whenever officers drew close. A policeman fired, missing again. Broken glass and twisted metal littered the asphalt. Deputy Thompson tried to coordinate a safe shot, but bystanders kept crossing his field of view. Samira's breathing grew uneven. Leo urged a passing medic to help her. The medic knelt, bandaging Samira's cuts, eyes grim. Eli asked if they could save Tony, but the medic only shook her head. Inside and out, everything felt hopeless. Aisha peeked through a window and saw ambulances stuck behind police lines. Helicopters hovered above, filming the chaos for the news. She typed a message on her phone, but there was no signal. A wail from down the corridor signaled more terror. Yukio and Daiichi tried to comfort a sobbing mother searching for her child. They guided her toward a secure nook, footsteps echoing in the flickering light. Gunshots echoed again. The fear of the bear entering the terminal gripped them all. A policeman who had served in the area for years remarked later that he had never seen such a sudden tragedy unfold in a normally peaceful place. The bear's lean frame suggested it had been struggling for food for quite some time. Experts believed changing weather patterns or competition with other predators had forced it to roam near human activity. Bozeman's residents were used to wildlife, but an attack of this scale was unheard of. Back inside the terminal, some passengers who were separated from loved ones demanded answers from officials. One man shouted that he needed to find his wife, who had run outside minutes before the bear arrived. Another woman tried to push past security to reach the parking lot. Fear and uncertainty fueled angry outbursts. The airport staff did their best to maintain order, though many were just as terrified. Over the next hour, rescue teams methodically checked each section of the lot. They found several wounded travelers hiding behind vehicles. One had a broken leg. Another suffered cuts from shattered glass. Medics treated them on the spot, then carried them through the same doors the bear had breached. The scene was surreal. Baggage carts turned over, suitcases tossed aside, alarms still flashing. In the aftermath, officers discovered that the fence had been weakened by recent storms. Snowdrifts and high winds might have bent the links enough for a determined bear to slip through. Airport officials promised a full investigation, vowing to reinforce security measures to prevent any future disaster. Yet no change could fully erase the memory of that day. For many, the Grizzly's final roar remained an echo of nature's power and fragility. The survivors left the airport with new scars, both physical and emotional. Though the flight boards would light up again, and travelers would return, the shadow of March 11th would linger for anyone who witnessed the terror that a single desperate animal could unleash. Time moved on. In the days following March 11th, 2025, Bozeman Yellowstone International Airport remained closed to the public. Police tape fluttered around the wrecked vehicles and twisted fence. Investigators and wildlife officers combed the grounds, documenting evidence of the attack. The bear's body had been removed and examined by biologists, who confirmed it was severely malnourished. News outlets labeled the tragedy unthinkable, making headlines around the world. Inside a cordoned section of the terminal, staff cleaned shattered glass and piled discarded suitcases. The overhead alarms had finally gone silent, yet the faint smell of smoke lingered, and dark stains on the floor reminded everyone of the horror still fresh in their minds. Paramedics wheeled Samira into a medical helicopter for urgent surgery at a larger hospital in Billings. Leo and Eli traveled with her. They sat in stiff chairs, each lost in private turmoil. Eli's camera lay idle in his bag. He could not bear to watch any footage from that day. Leo still struggled to accept that Tony was gone. Scenes of Tony falling to the bear's massive paw kept replaying in his mind. At the airport entrance, Aisha sank onto a bench. She felt numb, hugging her notebook against her chest. She had scrawled dozens of frantic observations during the crisis, but had not read them since. Every page felt haunted. Around her, first responders moved through the halls, escorting press crews back outside. She spotted Yukio and Daiichi behind a security officer. Both brothers looked drained, as if they had not slept for days. They spoke quietly, glancing at the damaged walls and taped-up doors. "What happens next?" Daiichi asked, his voice subdued. Yukio shrugged. "I guess we wait for statements, or get questioned by investigators." Neither knew how to process the chaos they had lived through. A short while later, uniformed police officers guided the brothers to an impromptu rest area, offering water bottles and blankets. They handed each a medical form, telling them that mental health support would be available. Yukio thanked them politely, though his hands shook. Daiichi stared at the form, trying to focus on simple questions. Name, birth date, any injuries. His mind kept drifting back to that dim corridor, the thunderous roars and the sight of broken carts scattered along the floor. Aisha recognized them and approached. "Are you both all right?" she asked softly. They nodded, though both had weary eyes. She introduced herself properly, explaining she was a freelance journalist. "I want to write about what happened," she said, "but it's hard to find the words." They understood. Words felt too small for such horror. Outside, the scene around the airport was equally grim. A cluster of reporters stood behind police barricades, their cameras aimed at the gates. Local residents gathered in quiet groups, some leaving flowers on the side of the road. Others placed candles in makeshift memorials for the victims. That evening, the sky turned red and gold, the sunset strangely calm. Early the next morning, The airport announced limited reopening for essential flights only. National Transportation Safety Board officials arrived, along with more wildlife experts. They took photos of the fenced perimeter, measured the hole the bear created, and examined footprints in the muddy ground. Debates sparked about better barriers and better warning systems. Officials from surrounding counties talked about stepping up patrols during harsh winters. Hospitals in Bozeman and Billings cared for the injured. Samira woke after surgery to a bright, sterile room. A deep ache gnawed at her shoulder and side, where claws and teeth had gouged flesh. Tubes and bandages covered much of her upper arm. She struggled to recall how she got there. Everything felt disjointed, a blur of screams, roars, and cold pavement. She turned her head and saw Leo, half asleep in a plastic chair. Eli dozed on a small sofa near the window, his eyes red from tears and exhaustion. When a nurse entered to check Samira's IV, Leo jolted awake. He leaned forward, relief shining in his face. "You're alive," he whispered. She nodded, wincing at the pain. "Tony?" she managed to say. Leo pursed his lips, then gently shook his head. Tears welled in her eyes. Meanwhile, in Bozeman's small morgue, the bodies of 7 tourists were identified. Among them was Tony Yip. The local coroner requested contact details for next of kin. The process of repatriating remains could be long, but the state promised to assist families overseas. Officers visited a downtown hotel where some travelers had rooms booked. Luggage and personal items would be returned eventually, though many objects were lost or destroyed. At the hospital, Eli struggled with guilt over surviving when Tony did not. He felt he should have done more. Samira tried to comfort him despite her own grief. "You couldn't have fought off that bear," she whispered, wincing from the pain in her ribs. It all happened too fast. Leo listened, remembering how Tony fell silent almost instantly. He saw that savage image every time he closed his eyes. A week after the attack, Aisha visited the survivors. She carried a small bouquet for Samira. Despite the horrors, she felt compelled to record their stories. The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant, and the overhead lights felt harsh. Samira looked pale but managed a weak smile. Aisha sat at her bedside, notebook balanced on her knee. "Are you ready to talk?" she asked. Samira nodded slowly. She described the moment the bear charged. She recalled Tony's brave act, though it had cost him his life. Her voice trembled with each detail. She recounted the panicked crowds, the alarms, the overwhelming confusion. When her words failed, tears took their place. Aisha gently put a hand on hers, promising to share the truth with respect. Meanwhile, Yukio and Daiichi, now staying at a local motel, spent their days consulting with embassy officials. Their families in Japan were frantic, relieved their sons were alive, but shaken by the tragedy. Daiichi found it difficult to eat or sleep, haunted by nightmares of the bear's roars. Yukio tried to make sense of the trauma by reading about bear behavior and territorial stress, yet the explanations did not erase the shock. On the 10th day after the attack, local authorities arranged a small memorial service for the victims. Families who could travel came, joined by local clergy and townspeople. White flowers were placed on a simple table. Photographs of the deceased stood nearby, including Tony's bright grin in an old snapshot. Samira stayed in a wheelchair, bandages still visible on her arm. Leo and Eli helped push her across the grass. Aisha stood quietly to the side, scribbling notes for an article that she now saw as part tribute, part plea for greater awareness of wildlife issues. An official from the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks explained how shrinking habitats and unusual weather patterns might drive bears into urban areas. He urged people to respect nature's boundaries and store food properly when traveling in bear country. His words felt urgent but also grim. Everyone knew that no official statement could undo the heartbreak. When the memorial ended, Samira laid a single yellow rose beneath Tony's photo. Tears slipped down her face. Eli closed his eyes, Remembering how Tony's jokes had brightened the plane ride, Leo gently touched Samira's shoulder. They stood there in silence, letting grief settle over them like the winter chill. Yukio and Daiichi joined them, bowing respectfully in front of each photograph. Although they had not known Tony well, they recognized his kindness. They remembered how he had tried to shield Samira. After a few moments, the brothers stepped aside, giving space for other mourners. A cluster of local residents approached, leaving flowers for the visitors who never made it home. In the following weeks, the story spread far. Media outlets debated who was to blame: airport security, poor fencing, changing climate, or random misfortune. Aisha wrote a long piece for an international magazine, highlighting Samira's fight to recover and the emotional toll on Leo, Eli, Yukio, and Daiichi. She emphasized that nature could be both beautiful and deadly, and that humans carried a responsibility to adapt. Samira slowly regained her strength, though her scars would remain. Eli returned to Australia, still haunted by nightmares. He hoped therapy could ease his guilt. Leo decided to stay in Montana until Samira could fly, partly as support, partly to honor Tony. They often spoke in hushed tones about that morning, replaying each moment as if searching for a different outcome. Yukio and Daiichi flew back to Japan sooner, accompanied by embassy staff. Before leaving, they met Aisha one last time, wishing her well. She urged them to keep in touch, saying that their shared experience had bound them together. Daiichi managed a faint smile, though tears gathered in his eyes. Yukio bowed, expressing deep gratitude for her kindness. Meanwhile, Bozeman Yellowstone International Airport undertook major renovations. Crews raised taller fences with reinforced steel and installed motion sensors to detect large animals. Warning systems were updated, and staff received extra training on emergency responses. A plaque near the entrance honored the lives lost, reminding travelers that nature's boundaries were never far away. Though flights soon resumed, the airport felt different. Locals passed through its halls with new caution. Some left flowers at the plaque, whispering prayers for the victims and a hope that such an event would never happen again. Tourists still came to explore Montana's wild landscapes, but the excitement carried a sharper edge. Everyone seemed more aware of how quickly beauty could turn to tragedy. At last, Samira and Leo boarded a flight home. From her window seat, Samira gazed at the runway. She pictured Tony's smile, recalling his eagerness to see real grizzlies. Tears welled up again, but she gripped Leo's hand. The plane rolled forward, climbing into the wide blue sky. Down below, the airport grew small, ringed by mountains and pine forests. In the quiet hum of the cabin, Samira whispered a soft goodbye to Tony, Montana, and the painful memories left behind. Yet she carried a piece of that day within her, a permanent reminder of life's fragility and of nature's fierce power. By her side, Leo stared at the clouds, replaying both heartbreak and gratitude for survival. Their future felt uncertain, but they knew they would face it together, honoring those who were lost. Across oceans and time zones, Yukio and Daiichi grieved in their own way, telling their families how quickly an ordinary airport trip had turned into a life-and-death struggle. Eli, back in Australia, sought therapy and penned raw, honest reflections on the fleeting nature of safety. Aisha continued writing articles that pushed readers to consider their relationship with wildlife. All of them were connected by one date they would never forget. In the end, the memory of that rampage settled into Montana's lore, etched into local consciousness. People still visited Bozeman to ski or hike, or see the region's famous parks. Officials hoped newly installed defenses and better training would keep everyone safe. Yet for those who had been there on March 11th, 2025, the line between civilization and wilderness would always feel paper-thin. The shock of a single desperate bear had shaken an entire community, leaving scars that ran deeper than any fence could mend.